Imagine for a moment the sea at dusk. Not stormy, not cruel, just vast. A long, slow swell rolling under a ship's hull, the sound of water sliding past old wood, a sound like breathing. Now imagine that ship, sail set, steady on her course, moving with purpose, as if someone were still at the wheel. And now imagine climbing aboard and finding no one there at all. Not a captain, not a crew, not a single soul. The table still set, the charts still folded in their place. A ship fully able to sail on her own, forever, and never quite explaining why she had to. This is a true story. It happened in the winter of 1872, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it has never, not once in over 150 years, been fully solved. Tonight we're going to drift into it together, slowly, the way we always do here. Welcome back to Duskferry. If this is your first night crossing with us, hello and welcome. This is a quiet place, a place where the day's noise is allowed to fall away, where old mysteries and old histories are told slowly, gently, without hurry, because the point was never to keep you awake. The point was always to carry you, like a ferry gliding through the dusk, from wherever your mind has been all day, into somewhere calmer. So before we begin, let's do what we always do. If you can, dim the lights around you now. Just a little less light in the room than there was a moment ago. Settle back into whatever is holding you. A pillow, a blanket, the mattress beneath you. And let it hold all of your weight. You don't have to hold any of it yourself right now. Take one slow breath in and let it out even more slowly than it came in. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Nothing else you need to solve or finish or answer. For the next little while, your only task is to listen and to let your body grow heavier and heavier with every passing minute. Tonight's story begins on a pier in New York on an ordinary morning in November, with a ship that had already in her short life earned a strange and uneasy reputation, long before the world would come to know her name. Let's step aboard. Chapter 1. The Voyage begins. Long before she was called Mary Celeste, the ship had another name, Amazon. She was built in 1861 on Spencer's Island, a small shipbuilding village on the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, where the tides rise and fall more dramatically than almost anywhere else on Earth. She was a brigantine. Two masts, sturdy, mid-sized, built for ordinary cargo runs across ordinary seas. And from the very beginning, sailors said there was something unlucky about her. Her first captain died of pneumonia, only days after taking command, before the ship had even completed her maiden voyage. Her second captain ran her aground on her very first Atlantic crossing, and she had to be repaired before she could sail again. Later, under yet another captain, she collided with yet another ship in the narrow waters of the English Channel. At one point, she caught fire. At another, she was found grounded on a reef off Cape Breton, seemingly abandoned by her crew, and had to be salvaged all over again. By the time an American consortium purchased her, rebuilt her, and gave her a new name in 1869, more than a few old sailors along the docks quietly said she should have stayed lost. Her new name was Mary Celeste. For a few years under new ownership, she seemed to settle into a quieter life. Small cargo runs. Nothing dramatic. And in the autumn of 1872, a new captain took her command. A man named Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Briggs was 37 years old, and by every account that survives him, he was careful, sober, deeply experienced, and well-respected. He came from a long line of sea captains. His own father, his brothers, his uncles had all commanded ships before him. He was not reckless. He was not the kind of man who took foolish risks with a vessel or a crew. Some later writers would even call him, half-jokingly, one of the most boring captains on the Atlantic, meaning it as the highest compliment a sailor could give. He did something that autumn that many captains of his era did not do. He brought his family aboard. His wife, Sarah, 30 years old, joined him for the voyage, and so did their daughter, Sophia Matilda, only 2 years old. There was a second child, a young son named Arthur, but he was left behind on land with Sarah's mother so that he could continue his schooling. It's a small human detail, easy to pass over. A mother saying goodbye to one child at the docks so she could bring the other one to sea. But it tells you something about the ordinary domestic nature of this voyage. This was not meant to be an adventure. It was meant to be work, a job, a crossing like any other. Joining Briggs, Sarah, and little Sophia was a crew of 8 sailors, a first mate, a second mate, a steward and cook, and 4 able seamen, most of them German, hired out of New York for this particular run. Contemporary accounts describe them, without exception, as competent and sober men. No history of trouble, no reason on paper for anyone to worry. In the hold beneath them sat the cargo, 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, industrial spirits, not for drinking, but for use in fortifying wine and in manufacturing, bound for the merchants of Genoa, Italy. On the 7th of November, 1872, the Mary Celeste slipped her lines at a pier on the East River in New York and began her crossing. The weather that first day was rough enough that Briggs actually chose to anchor for 2 extra days near Staten Island, waiting for calmer conditions before committing his family and his crew to the open Atlantic. It is, again, such a small, careful decision. The kind a nervous captain makes, not a reckless one. He was, by every sign we have, a man being as cautious as the sea allowed him to be. On the 9th of November, the weather settled, and the Mary Celeste finally turned her bow east toward Italy, toward the wide gray Atlantic, and began the long crossing that history remembers her for. Though not, of course, for the reasons anyone aboard her that morning could possibly have imagined. Somewhere out past Sandy Hook, past the last smudge of the American coastline sinking into the horizon behind them, the ship, the family, and the crew of the Mary Celeste passed out of the world that could account for them, and into the part of this story that no one has ever been able to fully explain. We'll follow her out there now, slowly. There's no need to rush toward what happens next. The sea doesn't rush, and neither will we. Chapter 2, The Last Log Entry. For 2 weeks, the crossing was, by every measure that survives, almost entirely uneventful. Captain Briggs kept a log, as every captain did, a running record of position, weather, and the small, unremarkable business of sailing a ship across an ocean. Reading it now, more than a century and a half later, is a strange experience. There is nothing in it that reaches forward to warn you. No unease, no sign of trouble. Just the quiet, patient bookkeeping of a working ship at sea. Winds shifting from the southwest. A squall passed through, nothing severe. Position marked by careful navigation, checked and rechecked against the stars and the sun, the way sailors had done for centuries before satellites existed to do it for them. Somewhere in that fortnight, in the long hours between watches, we can imagine the small, ordinary rhythms of life aboard her. Sarah Briggs, we know from letters she wrote earlier in the voyage, spent time with her daughter Sophia, up on deck when the weather allowed it. A small child's laughter, perhaps, carried briefly on the wind before disappearing into the vastness around the ship. She'd written home, in one surviving letter, about the calm stretches of the journey, about Sophia playing near the wheel, about the ordinary boredom of a long sea crossing. It was, by every account, an unremarkable voyage, which is, in its own way, exactly what makes what comes next so difficult to explain. The crew stood their watches. The cook prepared meals in the narrow galley. The sailors managed the ship's rigging, adjusting sail as the wind required, the way sailors had for as long as ships had crossed open water. And then, on the 25th of November, 1872, Captain Briggs made his final entry in the ship's log. It placed the Mary Celeste at a position roughly 6 nautical miles northeast of the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, a small cluster of Portuguese islands sitting alone in the middle of the North Atlantic, roughly a third of the way through their long crossing to Italy. The entry, like everyone before it, was calm, routine, a working notation from a working ship. There is one more detail worth sitting with, quietly for a moment. A separate slate, a temporary log, used for jotting quick notes before they were copied into the formal book, was later found aboard, with an entry for the following morning, the 26th of November, noting the ship passing the eastern point of the same island. And after that morning, Kona, nothing. No further entries, no further notes, no record of a storm, no record of an emergency, no record of any decision at all. For 9 days and for roughly 500 nautical miles of open Atlantic water, the Mary Celeste continued somehow to move forward, out past the Azores, out into wider and lonelier water. And no one alive can tell us what happened aboard her during those 9 days. Not what was said, not what was feared, not what was decided, in whatever final moments led to what came next. The ship sailed on, log unfilled, position unrecorded, carrying her cargo, her personal belongings, and all the small, unfinished business of 10 lives, toward a chance encounter with another ship, still more than a week away, that would turn the Mary Celeste from an ordinary vessel into one of the most enduring mysteries the sea has ever kept. We'll meet that other ship next. Let your breathing slow further as we go. There is nothing urgent in this story, only something unanswered. Chapter 3. The Discovery. On the 4th of December, 1872, a different ship was making her own crossing of the Atlantic. A Canadian brigantine named De Gracia, under the command of Captain David Morehouse. By complete coincidence, Morehouse and Briggs knew each other. They were by some accounts old friends, or at the very least familiar colleagues within the small, close world of Atlantic sea captains. Men who cross paths often enough in the same ports to recognize one another's ships on sight. In fact, the two captains had reportedly dined together in New York, just days before their respective ships departed, only weeks apart, on the same ocean. That afternoon, roughly 400 nautical miles east of the Azores, one of Morehouse's crew noticed a ship on the horizon, moving strangely. Her sails were set, but oddly, imperfectly, some of them appeared damaged or improperly trimmed, as though no one experienced were tending them. She yawed slightly as she moved, drifting off a straight course and correcting again, the way a vessel does when nobody is truly steering her. For nearly 2 hours, Morehouse and his men watched her through a telescope, growing more and more uneasy, before finally moving close enough to hail her. No one answered. Captain Morehouse sent his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, along with another sailor, across the water in a small boat to board her. What they found climbing up onto her deck was a ship that was, by every physical measure, still capable of sailing, and utterly empty. The wheel was unmanned. The main hatch was open. Below deck, they found several feet of water sitting in the bottom of the hold. Not an alarming amount for a ship of this size and age, nothing close to sinking, but water nonetheless. One of the ship's two pumps had been partially disassembled, its parts lying nearby, as though someone had been in the middle of checking or repairing it. A long-sounding rod, the tool used to measure how much water sat in the hold, was found lying on deck, not stowed away. The ship's only lifeboat, a small yawl normally lashed to the main hatch, was missing. Long, frayed lengths of rope trailed from where it had been secured, as though it had been cut loose, or had been towed and eventually torn free in some hurry. The ship's chronometer, the precise clock essential for calculating a ship's longitude at sea, was gone. So was the sextant, the instrument used for celestial navigation. Along with them, the captain's papers and the ship's register were missing, though the logbook itself, strangely, had been left behind in Briggs's own cabin, its final entry still dated the 25th of November. And yet, nearly everything else remained. In the captain's cabin, DeVoe found personal belongings still in place. Clothing, undisturbed, in drawers and trunks. A children's toy or two, left where a small hand might have set them down. A sewing machine, belonging to Sarah Briggs, with a reel of thread still resting on top of it, and a bird cage, empty of its bird, its little door hanging open, but the cage itself untouched, as though someone had simply, at some point, let it go. Below in the hold, the cargo of alcohol was found almost entirely intact. Only 9 of the 1,700 barrels were later found to be empty, and it's worth pausing on that, because it tells us clearly that whatever happened here, it was not piracy. No pirate crew in history has ever robbed a ship of everything valuable and left the actual cargo behind. There is one detail that has followed this story through more than 150 years of retelling: that the crew's meals were found still on the table, a pot of tea still faintly warm, breakfast half-eaten and abandoned mid-bite, as though everyone aboard had simply vanished between one spoonful and the next. It's a wonderfully eerie image. It has appeared in countless retellings ever since. But historians who have gone back to the original, sworn testimony from that day have found no solid evidence that this particular detail was ever actually reported by DeVoe or the De Gracia crew. It appears to have entered the story later, added, it seems, by writers who came after, drawn to the story precisely because it was already so strange, and wanting, understandably, to make it stranger still. What was real and sworn to under oath was simple, and in its own way, far stranger than any invented detail could be: a seaworthy ship, a calm sea, a cargo mostly untouched. Personal belongings left exactly where their owners had set them down, and not one single person anywhere aboard her. Captain Morehouse made the decision to sail the Mary Celeste himself alongside his own ship into port at Gibraltar, where her strange condition would soon draw the attention of the law, and the beginning of an investigation that would raise almost as many questions as it answered. Let the ship carry you there now, slowly. There's no need to hurry toward the answers. As you'll hear, even the people who searched hardest for them never fully found them. Chapter 4. The Investigation. When the Mary Celeste arrived at Gibraltar, under Captain Morehouse's men, she came under the authority of the Vice Admiralty Court, the body responsible, among other things, for salvage claims, whenever one ship rescues or recovers another at sea. Ordinarily, this would have been a simple matter. Morehouse and his crew had, in effect, saved a valuable ship and her cargo from drifting derelict across the Atlantic, and maritime law entitled them to a salvage payment for doing so. A straightforward transaction, handled quietly, and everyone goes back to their ordinary lives. But the man overseeing the case, the Advocate General of Gibraltar, a proctor named Frederick Solly Flood, did not see anything simple about it at all. Solly Flood was, by the account of nearly everyone who dealt with him, deeply suspicious by nature, and he became instantly convinced that something criminal lay behind the Mary Celeste's condition. He suspected murder. He suspected mutiny. At one point, he suspected that Morehouse and his own crew might have staged the entire scene themselves, murdering Briggs's crew in order to falsely claim a large salvage reward. At another point, he theorized that the crew of the Mary Celeste had broken into the alcohol cargo, gotten dangerously drunk, and murdered the captain and his family in some kind of chaotic mutiny. He ordered the ship searched, top to bottom, for any physical evidence of violence. The most dramatic moment of the entire investigation came when a sword was found in Captain Briggs's cabin, partially hidden beneath his bunk. On its blade, investigators found what appeared at first glance to be dark, reddish-brown stains. For a brief period, it seemed as though the mystery might resolve itself into something far more ordinary and far more tragic than a genuine unsolved disappearance. A story of violence aboard, a sword used, blood left behind as proof. But when the stains were properly examined, they were found not to be blood at all, simple rust and nothing more. The most concrete piece of physical evidence in the entire case dissolved, quite literally under closer inspection. No other sign of violence was ever found anywhere aboard the ship. No blood, no struggle, no damage consistent with a fight, a mutiny, or an attack of any kind. The investigation dragged on for months. Solly Flood brought in surveyors, doctors, and naval officers to examine every plank and fitting of the ship. Eventually, even he was forced to concede that there was no clear evidence of foul play. The final ruling of the court, delivered in March of 1873, awarded Morehouse and his crew a salvage payment, though a notably smaller one than they might ordinarily have expected. Roughly 1/5 of the ship and cargo's total value, reflecting perhaps the lingering unspoken suspicion that had shadowed the entire proceeding. And that was officially the end of it. No criminal charges were ever filed against anyone. No bodies were ever recovered. Not Captain Briggs, not Sarah, not 2-year-old Sophia, not one single member of the crew. No wreckage of the missing lifeboat was ever found. No message in a bottle, no later sighting, no deathbed confession, no grave. 10 people had sailed out of New York Harbor in November of 1872, and not one of them, not a single one, was ever seen again by anyone for the rest of recorded history. The official verdict, in the end, admitted plainly what everyone already suspected. The true cause of the abandonment of the Mary Celeste could not be determined, based on the evidence available, which left the rest of the world to do what people have always done, faced with a genuine, unresolved mystery. They began to theorize. We'll walk through those theories together next, unhurried, the way you might turn over old, smooth stones on a beach, examining each one in turn, before quietly setting it back down. Chapter 5. The Theories. Let's take them slowly, one at a time. There is no need to rush toward a conclusion tonight, especially since after 150 years, no one else has managed to reach one either. The first, and perhaps the most widely respected among historians and sailors alike, concerns the cargo itself. The 1,700 barrels in the hold were made, in this particular shipment, not of the tighter, more expensive red oak typically used for spirit barrels, but of ordinary oak. Barrels that were, we now know, more prone to letting vapor seep slowly out through their staves. As the ship crossed warmer waters near the Azores, it's entirely plausible that fumes from the alcohol began to build up in the cargo hold. If Captain Briggs, opening the hatch to check on his cargo, was met with a visible haze of vapor, or even the sound of the hold groaning under some pressure, a careful, cautious captain, exactly the kind of man Briggs was known to be, might reasonably have feared an imminent explosion. In this version of events, Briggs may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution, intending only a brief, temporary evacuation, tethering the small boat to the Mary Celeste by a length of rope, expecting to reboard once the danger passed, or once they'd confirmed the ship was safe. And then, perhaps a sudden gust of wind, a swell, an ordinary shift in the weather, and the rope connecting the two vessels snapped, or was never quite as secure as they believed, and the Mary Celeste, still carrying enough sail to move under her own power, simply drifted away faster than 10 people in a small open boat, far out into the Atlantic, could ever hope to row after her. It is, in many ways, the theory that best fits the physical evidence. It explains the missing lifeboat, the frayed rope, the abandoned navigation instruments, grabbed hastily on the way out in case they were needed, and the otherwise undamaged, untouched ship. It does not require imagining any violence, any storm severe enough to sink a fully rigged vessel, or any elaborate conspiracy at all. Just one small, human, reasonable decision made under uncertainty that turned out, tragically, to be wrong. There are other theories too, each with their own quiet supporters over the years. Some pointed to the weather itself. A waterspout, a sudden localized funnel of wind and water, capable of driving water down into an open hatch, explaining the flooding in the hold, and perhaps briefly swamping the deck in a way frightening enough to convince the crew the ship was sinking beneath them. Others suggested a seaquake, an underwater earthquake, capable of producing a sudden, violent shock wave that could shake a ship without ever damaging her hull, again convincing a worried crew that something catastrophic was happening below the waterline. For a time, mutiny was a popular theory. The idea that the crew rose up against Briggs, perhaps in a dispute over the ship's course or conditions, and either killed him and his family or forced them off the ship. But nothing in the historical record supports this. These were, by every account we have, experienced, sober, well-regarded sailors, with no history of trouble, no evidence of conflict, and, crucially, no motive that anyone has ever been able to identify. Piracy, too, was considered and quickly discarded, for the same reason we touched on earlier. No pirate in history has ever left behind a fully intact, valuable cargo, along with jewelry, money, and other easily portable valuables that were later confirmed still aboard. Insurance fraud was suggested as well. The idea that Briggs himself, or the ship's owners, arranged the entire disappearance for a payout. But Briggs held only a minority financial interest in the voyage, had a spotless reputation, and, most tellingly of all, brought his own wife and 2-year-old daughter along with him. It is difficult to imagine any fraud scheme, however desperate, that would require endangering one's own small child to pull off. And then, of course, there are the stranger theories, the ones that belong less to history and more to folklore. Sea monsters, giant squid, said to have risen from the deep and dragged the crew overboard one by one. Ghostly forces, curses tied to the ship's earlier unlucky history as the Amazon. These make for wonderful stories around a fire, or in a tale like this one, late at night. But they exist far outside anything the physical evidence actually supports. What remains after all these theories are weighed against one another is something quietly unsatisfying, in the way real mysteries so often are. Not a dramatic villain, not a monster, just a small, ordinary human misjudgment, made in a moment of fear, at sea, far from anyone who could help, and a rope that didn't hold. We will likely never know for certain which of these explanations is true, but the not knowing is, in its own strange way, part of what has kept this story alive for so long, carried forward gently from one telling to the next. Let your mind rest here for a moment among the possibilities, without needing to choose between them. We'll continue drifting forward into what happened to the ship herself in all the years that followed. Chapter 6. The Ship's Curse. The Mary Celeste, unlike her captain and crew, did not disappear. She was repaired, refitted, and put back into ordinary commercial service. And yet, in the years that followed, she seemed to carry her strange reputation with her from owner to owner, like something that could not quite be scrubbed off her decks. No one, understandably, wanted to be closely associated with a ship that had become a subject of newspaper speculation on both sides of the Atlantic. Her value dropped. She changed hands more than a dozen times over the following decade, passing between owners who, by more than one later account, found her difficult to insure, difficult to crew, and dogged by a persistent run of minor misfortune, small groundings, cargo damage, disputes, and financial losses that seemed to follow her from port to port. Sailors, as sailors do, began quietly avoiding her. A ship with a reputation like hers was not an easy one to staff. Her story finally fully ended in January of 1885, more than 12 years after that final log entry in the Azores. By then, she was under the command of a captain named Gilman Parker. Parker deliberately steered the Mary Celeste onto a well-known reef near Haiti called the Rochelet Reef, and then attempted to claim a fraudulent insurance payment on both the ship and a cargo that investigators later determined was worth far less than what had been declared. The scheme fell apart quickly. Parker and his co-conspirators were put on trial for barratry and fraud in a case that generated real public attention, given the ship's already famous name. But in a strange, quiet echo of her earlier mystery, the case ended without a conviction. The court proceedings collapsed on a technicality, and Parker was never formally punished for what he had done. He did not, however, escape entirely unscathed. Within just a few months of the trial's collapse, Gilman Parker had lost his ship, his money, and his reputation entirely. He died in poverty later that same year. A small, sad footnote at the very end of a much larger story. And the Mary Celeste herself, left where Parker had run her aground, slowly broke apart on the reef, her old timbers finally giving way to the same ocean she had crossed and recrossed for over 2 decades. What remained of her sank into the shallow water off the coast of Haiti, where, more than a century later in the 2000s, marine archaeologists would spend years searching for her remains among the coral, working from old insurance documents and survey records, trying to positively identify what little of her might still exist beneath the waves. So ends the life of the ship herself. Not with mystery this time, but with something almost mundane: greed, fraud, and a slow physical dissolution into the sea that had already taken so much from her 13 years before. But her story as a story was really only just beginning, because 2 years after she was found empty and drifting, a young doctor and struggling writer on the other side of the Atlantic would take her name and her mystery and turn it into something the world would never quite be able to separate from the truth again. Let's meet him next. Eureka, Chapter 7. The Fiction That Became Legend. In January of 1884, 12 years almost to the month after the Mary Celeste was found drifting near the Azores, a short story appeared, unsigned, in a British publication called the Cornhill Magazine. It was titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, and it was presented deliberately in the style of a genuine first-person account, the supposed memoir of a survivor from an ill-fated ship. Its author had changed the vessel's name only slightly, calling it the Mary Celeste, with an extra E inserted into her first name. The story was vivid, dramatic, and almost entirely invented. It described a passenger aboard who was secretly plotting against the crew. It gave the disappearance a sinister, almost supernatural undertone. It included details that sounded utterly convincing, presented with just enough real names and real facts woven through the fiction to feel like an authentic historical record, rather than the work of imagination it actually was. Its author was a young, still largely unknown doctor from Portsmouth, England, named Arthur Conan Doyle, years before he would create Sherlock Holmes and become one of the most famous writers in the English language. The story was an immediate sensation. Readers across Britain and America devoured it, many of them entirely convinced it was a genuine, factual account of what had truly happened aboard the ship. Newspapers reprinted portions of it as though it were real reporting. And even after Doyle's authorship became known and the story was properly understood as fiction, its details had already, quietly, begun seeping into the public's understanding of the actual historical event. To this day, more than a century later, you can find retellings of the Mary Celeste's story that unknowingly borrow small details straight from Doyle's invented tale. The extra E in her name, dramatic flourishes about the crew's final moments, embellishments that feel so natural to the story by now that it takes real, careful historical digging to separate what sailors and investigators actually swore to under oath in 1873 from what a talented young writer imagined for the sake of a good story more than a decade later. It's a strange, fitting final layer to add onto an already strange story. The Mary Celeste disappeared into a real, unsolved mystery. And then over time, fiction quietly climbed aboard the empty ship too, and has been sailing alongside the truth, indistinguishable to most people ever since. Perhaps that's simply what happens to any mystery that goes unsolved for long enough. We cannot bear to leave the space entirely empty. So piece by piece, generation by generation, we fill it in. A detail here, an embellishment there, until the space where the true answer should be feels, at last, a little less empty than it did before. Let's carry that thought with us now, gently, as we bring tonight's crossing to its close. Closing, so there she drifts in the end, a ship built on a tide-swept shore in Nova Scotia, unlucky from her very first voyage, renamed and rebuilt, and finally, briefly ordinary. Carrying a careful captain, his wife, his small daughter, and 8 sober, capable sailors, out past the Azores, and into a question that has now outlived every single person who could have answered it. We will never know with certainty what happened aboard the Mary Celeste in those 9 unrecorded days. We only know that something made 10 people step off a ship that was never actually sinking into a small boat on a calm sea, and that the ship sailed on without them, into history, while they sailed on into silence. There is something strangely peaceful in that if you let yourself sit with it rather than fight it. Not every question gets answered. Not every story resolves neatly, and yet the world continues on regardless. The sea keeps rolling, the tide keeps turning, ships keep sailing out of harbors every single morning into futures no one can fully predict. Maybe that's really what a story like this one is for. Not to hand you an answer, but to remind you gently that you don't need one in order to rest. You made it safely to the end of tonight's crossing. Wherever you started this evening, however full your mind was when you first pressed play, you can let it stay a little emptier now, a little quieter. Let your body sink further into the bed beneath you. Let your breathing slow and settle and grow heavy. Like the Mary Celeste herself, you don't need to be steering anything right now. You can simply drift. If you enjoyed tonight's crossing, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. New calm stories arrive here every week, carrying you gently from wherever your day has been into wherever your rest is waiting. Until then, good night, sleep well. This has been Duskferry.